Well, thank you so much. What an honor to be with all these terrific and insightful policymakers. Batting cleanup, I guess we are, for this 20 years later 9/11 conversation. We've heard a lot of back and forth, I would say, about what to make of this last 2 decades, and what just happened really in the last 2 months of American policy, showing what a dynamic and moving target we have to discuss. But I'm hoping that we can also move the conversation forward with this last discussion. I'm struck, as I'm sure many of you are, by the extent to which a lot of these 9/11 retrospectives, are convinced of a certain set of assumptions, I think, that underlie even very different interpretations. And that has to do with the fact that there was this pivot point in American foreign policy, and now we're at another hinge moment, and this era is definitively behind us, and now we've moved on to some other era. So I want to start actually out by that and say, like, is that assumption that we're making, is that a correct one? And what do our panelists think about this? Are we slamming the door right now on the 9/11 era, on this notion of a war on terror, and on this notion of an American superpower that operates abroad in a way that perhaps it will no longer do in the future? So I know it's a nice, simple question to start out with. Fran, I'm going to start out with you, actually, since you were there at the very beginning of what did become known as President Bush's global war on terror. Obviously, you didn't anticipate that it would be a 20-year affair, but let me just ask you, do you think that we are slamming the door shut on whatever that era was? And, where are you at personally in terms of thinking about the meaning of this?
So, Susan, thank you for moderating this. And it's a real privilege to be with my good friend, Jane Harman, again, and back with Jane Lute. It's great to be here. Look, as you said, I think for each of us, we have our own 9/11 story. But right now, I think we tend to think in terms of foreign policy as periods, right? When we study them, we study different periods as if these are discrete timeframes, one not impacting the next. And that's just not true. It's a convenient sort of mechanism to study foreign policy and history, but it's not actually true when you're a policymaker. And so you ask me about, are we shutting the door on this 9/11, post 9/11 history period? Not only are we not, we can't. If you had asked me if I could imagine a set of circumstances in which 20 years later, the Taliban would be back ruling Afghanistan, I would have thought you were kidding. But here we are. And so, no, we won't be able to shut the door. But even during the Bush administration, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, I can remember when Condi Rice was the national security advisor in that first term, we were already frustrated that all of foreign policy at that period was viewed through this counterterrorism lens. And we knew even then that we had to broaden the aperture and be able to do other issues and deal with other issues in foreign policy. Look, I do think we've learned to open that aperture. It's been across multiple administrations. We do understand that our being uniquely focused in the Middle East has been to the advantage of our biggest competitors like China, who have taken advantage of our lack of attention in other places to gain strength and prominence. And so a way of saying to you, I don't think we're going to shut that door, but I do think that we have to, if you will, mind that store. The threat has not gone away. And in fact, I feel for the current administration, they're really fighting on two fronts, both a foreign terrorist threat and a domestic terrorist threat. And I think on a foreign policy stage, they're going to need their allies, not just to deal with the Middle East, but now to deal with Asia, China, and in particular.
Well, thank you, Fran. I want to go to the first of our Janes, Jane Holl Lute. You also, saw this 2-decade period unfold, from the very beginning. Do you think American engagement in the Middle East will be fundamentally different from this point forward and shaped by these failures? Or are we just going to kind of move on and pretend that the failures didn't happen?
No, I don't think there's any pretending at all. And in this regard, I agree with Fran in that this convention that we have of thinking of in eras. You know, for me, I divide my foreign defense experience and international security into four, sort of phases. Phase one was the period immediately after World War II, which informed so much of American foreign policy. And we were answering a very central strategic question right after World War II. How do we prevent the scourge of war, which, to quote the UN Charter, twice in our lifetime brought untold sorrow and misery to mankind? How do we prevent World War III? That was the major strategic question coming out of World War II. The major strategic question during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union is how do we prevent nuclear annihilation when the only thing standing between us and the precipice is our judgment? The period that sort of ended, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it ushered in this unipolar moment, perhaps, as Charles Krauthammer wrote, or it ushered in a period what people saw during the Gulf War was the United States was that much more powerful than anyone else. And the real deep strategic question operating through the 90s into the early 2000s was, what will the United States do with its power? And since the Iraq War of 2003 and to today, the major strategic question that's on everyone's mind is just how fragile is the American commitment to democratic values? They see that abroad and they see it at home. So in that sense, I think we are in a very distinct period that sort of brings the 9/11 experience forward. Now, the other thing I will say is domestically and bureaucratically, I think in Washington, the Cold War, civilians and military had a very robust interchange and dialogue during the Cold War. The concepts that guided US defense and foreign policy were abstract concepts, mutually assured destruction, containment. Civilians participated aggressively in those debates and with stature because, frankly, most of them were invented by civilians. In the post-Cold War period, beginning again through the 90s, the concepts that have dominated American foreign policy have been operational concepts, military operational concepts. Can you move a brigade in 96 hours? Do you know what a brigade is? So we are coming out of a period, we have been in a period, in my view, of an imbalance between the domestic or the civilian and the military voices. And frankly, I think we've been in a period of some unhealthy military idolatry. We're coming out of that. And in part, the experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan have contributed to that change now. So there's definitely a change going on, but there's also continuity.
I think I want to really unpack a lot of what you said, especially this notion that we're returning almost to a moment of first principles, if you will, in terms of trying to figure out what American foreign policy is going to be and how much it's challenged by our internal divides and debates. And I think that's a great note to bring Jane Harman into this. What about the politics of American foreign policy? Do you see them as having been sort of colored and shaped by this last 2 decades frame of the forever war? Jane, was that the mistake, at least the political mistake that we made in terms of having this open-ended authorization for a war that would never end? I mean, in some ways, Secretary Gates just now answered the question, I think right before you came on, with one version of the forever war, but you could argue that it does actually apply to this question of Congress and Washington's version, which is to say that it apparently authorized a forever war, and you were there for that. Tell us what you think.
Okay, well, first let me salute Aspen for having the wisdom to have an all-woman panel. I mean, if we want to have a serious discussion, let's have a serious discussion led by Susan Glasser. And to Anya, who is the leader or co-leader, but future leader of the strategy group, you go, girl. I think this is wonderful. And all of us know each other. We've worked together forever. So this is not a new meeting of the minds. I recently wrote a book, Susan, which you may know, called Insanity Defense: Why Our Failure to Confront Hard National Security Problems Makes Us Less Safe. And my theory of the case overlaps with what Fran and Jane said. My theory of the case is not going all the way back to World War II, but going back to the end of the Cold War. I think that we didn't have a strategy going forward. We won, they lost. We were the sole superpower, and a combination of hubris, intellectual laziness, arrogance, list a bunch of things, convinced us that everybody wanted to be us. So in the 90s, we missed the rise of China, which, oops, didn't want to be us, wanted to have a completely separate form of governance and economy. We missed the rise of terrorism. I know that because I was on the National Commission on Terrorism formed by Congress in the late 90s. We were one of 3 commissions that predicted a major attack on US soil. Nobody was listening. And on 9/10/2001, I had lunch with Jerry Bremer, the chairman of our commission, later to be in Iraq. And we were bemoaning the fact that no one was paying attention. Then after 9/11, a good thing happened, which I don't think has been mentioned yet, which is we articulated our problem as America under attack. America was under attack, not the Democrats did this to the Republicans did this to the Democrats, somebody stole an election. This was all about a more high-minded frame, and the world wanted to come to our aid. To remind you all, Iran wanted to help us. They were not part of the 9/11 story, regardless of claims afterward. Cuba offered us landing rights in their airports when we closed our airfields, fearing a future attack. NATO invoked Article 5. Nick Burns always talks about this because he was the ambassador to NATO. He didn't ask for it. First and last invocation of the common defense provision. And Congress stepped up. This is this is where I'm going with this. Congress stepped up to authorize action against those who attacked us, and in a fairly careful for Congress authorization, and to do other things. Some good, some bad. We can go into that later. But my point is that the 9/11 caused us to have a whatever you want to call it. It was a crucible. We acted wisely for a period, and then we fell back into, it seems to me, because we didn't have an overarching strategy after the Cold War, into inattention, arrogance, hubris, and whatever else, over-militarized our response and made a series of mistakes, which has led us to this moment. And I'm sure you're going there, Susan, but I think in many ways we are less safe than we were on 9/11, and we squandered some enormous opportunities to build a more integrated world and to develop a strategy leading with soft power that never happened.
Jane, I want to just follow up quickly before I go back to the others. In terms of Congress, do you think it is possible right now, given the extreme polarization and the difference from 20 years ago, this idea that it was a national attack that would have a national response, is it possible to have a national foreign policy at a time when essentially half of the country is going to reflexively disagree with anything that the other half of the country produces?
Well, Joe Biden is trying to help make that happen. He has a foreign policy that he's articulated, which is basically moving away from some of the GWAT things, the global war on terror things that were put in place. And I supported some of those things, so shame on me. But he's also urging Congress to repeal and replace the threadbare 2001 AUMF for Afghanistan. And the 2002 one that we enacted, I voted for it based on flawed intelligence for Iraq, really doesn't apply to anything anymore. But so Joe Biden is part of urging a course correction that would reflect some bipartisanship. Will he get very far? Well, not yet, but there is a move in Congress, bipartisan, to repeal and replace the 2001 AUMF. So I guess I'm forever hopeful. If I weren't an optimist, why would I have served in Congress for 9 terms?
Well, that is true. I must say, I remember when Barack Obama, endorsed the idea of repealing and replacing the AUMF, and it's been a while since he was president. Fran, we've been talking in a sort of a high altitude, almost abstract way so far. Let's get a little bit more practical for a moment. In the wake of the US's defeat and exit from Afghanistan, what is your view about the nature of the terrorist threat that is being faced, and is there an actual policy in place? We have spent a lot of time sort of critiquing, the infrastructure that was built up over 2 decades since 9/11. But I see a lot of really contradictory views right now as to whether this does or doesn't actually threaten American national security. What is your view?
So, look, I do think Elizabeth Sherwood Randall is President Biden's Homeland Security advisor. She is another woman, Jane, you'll be proud, who has been in this sort of international and national security policy arena for decades. She's very, very competent. I think that what we're going to find, look, the international threat is not going to go away. There was always a frustration in calling the effort the global war on terror, because what it really was an effort directed against an ideology. Terror isn't a thing, it's an ideology that you're really fighting, which makes it more difficult. And that ideology has not gone away. I worry, my concern about the international threat goes up. We have to remember that the Taliban gave safe haven to bin Laden and al-Qaeda. And so now that they're back in charge of Afghanistan, that really concerns me. First and foremost, what we used to do when we assess the international threat is look around the world for ungoverned or poorly governed spaces, because that's where the scourge of terrorism has the sort of darkness in which it can grow. And I don't think that's going away. And so I think the Biden administration is going to have to continue to keep an eye on that and devote resources to it, but not to the exclusion of other things. There are other important foreign policy issues and objectives that have to be addressed. There has not been sufficient attention or time at a policy level on climate change. I think it was right to give that to a single individual, John Kerry in this case, who can devote their time and attention to it. But that has to be a part and parcel of a foreign policy agenda everywhere we go. And that's what we understood in the counterterrorism world. That had to be on the agenda in every country, regardless of whether or not they had a terrorist threat themselves. In order to make progress, you needed allies and partners who understood that it was a priority. I think that to the extent that the Biden administration wants to make progress on trade, on human rights, on climate change, on things about which there should not be a lot of debate, that has to get on and be on consistently the foreign policy agenda. The other piece to the threat, though, I will just mention, and that is the domestic side. Liz in the White House has to watch both. And frankly, I think we have to be careful not to have resources against one threat to the exclusion of the other. The terrorists don't look at it that way, and neither can we. We have to be able to fight on both fronts.
So Jane, Holl, Lute, there's a lot to unpack of what we've already discussed, but let me ask you to throw a few more things on the table, though, because as we look beyond what just happened in the last few weeks in Afghanistan, I'm curious what initial geopolitical fallout you see happening. There's been a lot of talk about allies, for example. Do you see this as a kind of a permanent problem with the Europeans as they begin to understand that it wasn't just Donald Trump's rhetoric that was causing a lack of consultation between the United States and Europe? So, how do you assess the sort of fallout from Afghanistan when it comes to US allies? What do you think about the region? And Pakistan is something that I think is really not discussed nearly as much as it should be in the context of everything that has just happened, including the ability of the Taliban to wage this sort of blitzkrieg across Afghanistan and to retake power so swiftly this summer.
So you've added more, Susan, to the mix. I want to pick up on several points that both you and my co-panelists have made, which I think are smart and right on point. We are a divided polity right now, 50-50, 49-51, whatever it is. This is an environment that permits any policy and compels no policy because you're evenly divided. So you might as well have the satisfaction of doing the right thing. And what is the right thing for the United States right now? The right thing is not for us to go back into a defensive crouch. We don't function very well in a defensive crouch, and the institutions, whether it's NATO or the United Nations, don't function well with the United States in a defensive crouch. We need to take stock of the mistakes that were made, and frankly, I think a lot of those mistakes would fall under what I call violating the Christopher Columbus rule. I mean, in many cases in Afghanistan and Iraq, you know, the United States is guilty of failing to distinguish what's new from what's new to you. There was an awful lot of expertise, both regional expertise and expertise about how we build capable societies. Nation building, I think, is a misnomer. You know, there are nations that exist there, but capable governance, you know, market economic activity, robust civil society based on the rule of law. I mean, this was the agenda of the United States with the Marshall Plan. You know, we wanted capable partners. We didn't want dependencies. And so, you know, and we didn't want client states. So when we look at what does the US need at this moment, particularly with respect to foreign policy, I think we need four things. I think we need a safe and secure homeland, and that has both domestic implications and international implications. I think we need a dynamic economic engine that can generate new wealth. I think we need strong friends and allies, and I think we need predictable relations with others. Now, that economic engine to generate new wealth, that's a high bar. But predictable relations with others, that's a relatively low bar. That's about the rule of law. And forever in my lifetime, the US has been associated with that. And in each of those, you can identify priorities that the United States should pursue. But one of the things we also need to do is to understand how this Homeland Security enterprise, which has grown up over the last 15 years, and Fran had a key role to play in this regard, so did Jane for that matter. You know, when I got to the department in 2009, it was just about 5 or 6 years old. It was not 1 year old for the 5th or 6th time. I mean, there was accumulation of experience and learning and knowledge, and it was largely bipartisan achieved. And we tried to preserve that over the course of my time there. And what you learn is Homeland Security is an important contribution to national security, but it is an entirely different approach to security. And we need to understand how to use the value and the learning that we have from that setting, the homeland setting, and bring it into the national security priority. Take Pakistan, as you mentioned. I mean, one of the things that I did when I was deputy at Homeland Security is I opened up and continued a lot of bilateral dialogues. I mean, we had bilateral dialogues not only with the Canadians and the Mexicans, with the Brits, with the Germans, with the French, with the EU, and with China requested one, Russia requested one. So we were opening these up. This is a place also to have a dialogue with the Pakistanis as well.
Susan, could I add one thing here? And I hope everyone agrees. I agree with every word Jane just said. But I think we still, this conversation is focused on government-centric activity. And I think what we have learned over time is that governments are not capable of managing these problems solo. I'm talking about federal, state, local, international organizations, et cetera, because most of these groups are not government, they may be, you know, government sanctioned, but they are so-called rogue actors, and they function without government. And the tools that they use don't respect national boundaries, such as cyber, AI, and an argument, as Fran said, which you have to defeat with a better argument. You can't defeat this argument by adopting practices, some of which we did, that have to do with incarceration and detention, and that have to do with weaponized drones that have, you know, it's a civilian casualty component, and that have to do with, you know, over militarizing the response, as Jane Lute said. So I'm just saying, we have to think about this anew, and we really have to think about the power of action outside of government as an adjunct to government. And just my last comment on cyber, for example, 85% is I think I understand, 85% of our internet capabilities outside of government. And a lot of the innovation that will defeat some of the pernicious use of cyber against us is developed outside of government. So those of us who were very active in government, I guess, have to salute Fran in particular, who had the wisdom to develop a big shot private sector career after a big shot government career.
All right,
So
well,
if I could
Fran,
just put a coda on this. Sorry, just Jane Harman put her finger exactly on it. If we did not learn the fundamental lesson of Iraq and Afghanistan and this 9/11 period, Susan, that you're asking about, it's the following, in my view. Force cannot do all that needs doing, and all that needs doing cannot be done alone. And that involves the private sector as well as others, governments.
Fran, is there any way, though, to see this as anything other than a devastating loss for the United States that actually will have an impact on new kinds of threats, whether it's cyber or otherwise? I mean, I get what we're saying about, well, we're going to change our framework of looking at things now, but I worry that in many of the conversations around this anniversary, what we're not hearing is yet a real acceptance of the actual nature of the blow to the U.S. ability to operate in the world with partners. Many of these are private sector tools and capabilities developed here inside the United States that are now being used to weaken U.S. power. And I want to ask about, the ability to think about new threats at a time when we haven't been able to think about what are dealing with the old threats wrought.
Look, I think that both Janes, but Jane Harman's point about the private sector is an important one here. Look, we have never, when I tried to bring in private sector help when I was in the government, there were 1,000 reasons you couldn't do it, right? There were competitive reasons, and there were inspectors general, and there was a bureaucracy that absolutely walled off the private sector from the government. Now, the Department of Homeland Security cracked through some of that. But boy, if you're in the private sector, and I can tell you now working the other way, you have to really want to fight your way in. And you have to really want to devote resources and time into getting to the government, the right place to get the right information and to help them help themselves. And so there is no place where this is actually more important, if you put cyber aside for a second, than on the foreign policy front. Our business leaders, our corporate leaders travel all over the world. They have their own relationships. They make observations. Many of them are patriotic Americans who volunteer some of that, but we don't harness that in a way that we ought to harness it. I think if you talk about early on, what is the geopolitical effect of this 20-year war against terror? And the answer to me is simple. It's the rise of China, right? While we were focused solely in the Middle East and solely against this threat, China initiated their Belt and Road Initiative. They were developing relationships all over the world, and financial relationships and dependencies. Nowhere is that more apparent than in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They've built a mining business there. They've been supportive of the Taliban. They funded Pakistan to be supportive of the Taliban. This is why I started with, we have to not look at each problem through a straw. These things are related and we must see them as related. And lastly, you talk about, is the result of this instability in partnerships a result of this 20-year war? In fairness, I think there are a lot of factors. I mean, this was exacerbated during the Trump administration when our allies didn't know what was going to happen from one day to the next. And so I think we've got a lot of repair work. The Biden administration has a lot of repair work now to do to give our allies a sense that we first principles, to use a phrase that others have used, that we are coming back to first principles about what our priorities are and how we are going to work with our allies against our common threats like China. China may be the one place, Jane Harman, in Congress where there is some hope for bipartisan support for foreign policy.
So I want to pick up on that with the two Janes, and also encourage anyone who's listening, if you want to throw some questions at us, I'll try to get to a few questions before we have to wrap up today. So please go ahead and put those in the Q&A function. But I want to ask both Jane's about this issue of China and kind of America's ability to do strategic foreign policy making. Because the truth is that it's not really that we spent 20 years focusing on the Middle East and doing nothing else, in the sense that this is now, by my reckoning, the third straight US administration that's pivoting to China, right? You had Barack Obama, in fact, literally saying, his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, wrote an article for Main Foreign Policy magazine, which said that the administration was going to be pivoting to China, causing much consternation and concern over the use of that term. Donald Trump, not in quite the same way, was pivoting to China and a much more hawkish view of great power competition being the be-all and end-all of American foreign policy. And now you have President Biden, whose top foreign policy advisor, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, came into office saying that China was the top geopolitical problem and challenge for the United States of the 21st century. So lots of rhetoric has been going on for at least half of this post 9/11 period. And yet it doesn't seem that we have managed to strategically pivot or even have the ability to create a strategic vision of American foreign policy that we're executing on. So that's what I want to ask Jane, Lute, and then Jane Harman before we get to some of the audience questions is that, A, is China the biggest geopolitical challenge, and B, is the US capable of doing more than talking about pivoting to challenging it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll come back you won't like my answer. I think our biggest geostrategic political challenge is not losing faith in each other in this country and attending to our democracy, so that we can get out of this defensive crouch and move forward and engage on a whole range of issues. We've never had the luxury of saying, this is number one, this is number two, this is number three. I mean, there are fair arguments to be made all around. If you ask me, and preventing, securing the security of the American homeland, job one remains preventing another terrorist attack, which has not occurred in the West since 2005 on a major scale. And that job needs to continue. So I think the biggest development affecting our view of China is the rise of cybercrime. And the cyber threat that they pose, and the theft that has been going on for decades of intellectual property and others, but associated with the Chinese military. Coming back to the point Jane Harman made earlier, what is our theory of the case when it comes to the relationship that the United States wants to have with China? What's our theory of the case regarding Russia? How will we use the alliance? And are these articulable theories? Are these articulable arguments that make sense to the American people so that they can support a unified set of priorities on the foreign policy front and not allow them to continue to be so partisanized? They will always be politicized. I mean, that's the nature of the beast. The danger now is that they've become part.
Yeah, no, I mean, just to be clear, I think that's very much on the mark, and it's our internal challenges that are our foreign policy challenges as well as our external ones. Jane, Harman, what about China before I get to some of these other questions?
Well, a couple of things. First, I mentioned that in the 90s, hubris, intellectual laziness, and a focus on the so-called peace dividend and no strategy following the end of the Cold War led us to miss China's rise. We missed it, and China didn't want to be us, and China doesn't want to be us. And it took a long time for us to wrap our heads around it. I remember in Congress in the late 90s, I was there, voting for, which I still think has its pluses, permanent trade relations with China, a huge market for us, still a huge market for us. Even the folks who support Donald Trump for president and think the election was unfair, many of them think China's a huge market. After 9/11, I think, yes, I love the defensive crouch idea, but I think two other things happened. One, we switched from China embracing to China bashing. And I would argue that both parties do it. And they do it with ease, and that Joe Biden does it too. I mean, that's not his only note on China, but it plays politically to bash China. And there are reasons to bash China. Let me endorse what Jane Lute was saying. But there are also reasons to work with China on, again, threats that cross national boundaries like climate, which we are trying to do, and trade, which is useful for the US and surely for these allies, including the Quad that we are trying to work through and build up in Asia. One good thing we are doing, let's all clap, is sending Nick Burns into the fire. Hopefully he will be confirmed soon, but we couldn't have a better pick for a U.S. ambassador, one who comes with enormous experience, a great temperament, and of course, a huge attachment to the Aspen Strategy Group. So yay, everybody. But my last comment on this is, going forward, we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. Henry Kissinger would say this. I mean, at 98 years young, the guy who, with Richard Nixon, opened the door to China would say that we don't want war with China, that we do want to confront China where necessary, but we also want to build bridges to China. And I shudder to think that there is not very much nuance and capacity in Congress, and certainly too much partisanship, to actually understand the subtlety of that. And ongoing China bashing is not going to get us where we need to go.
Jane, thank you. I can't remember the last time I heard the words nuance and the word Congress used in the same sentence. So thank you for that. We don't have time for very much, but there are a couple interesting quick audience questions before we wrap up. Fran, we've talked a little bit about cyber and both you and Jane Lute have said this is something that should be much more of a focus. Bruce McKever in the audience asked, why don't we have a cyber police agency? And I'll just broaden that to sort of say, like, it seems like China, this is something we talked about for the last decade without necessarily having a coherent approach.
So I think this was President Trump's intent when he created a cyber force in the military. But as we've discussed, the military can't be the only response. I can remember during the Obama administration, with that sort of thought in mind, look, there is tremendous capability in the private sector, but we have capability inside the government. The problem is the different places where those pockets of capability are compete with each other for talent. And one of the answers to that, in my judgment, was to have a single integrated cyber operations center, where, sort of like we created the National Counterterrorism Center, so we had a complete and total picture of information related to the threat. The president would have one place to go, one dog to kick, where all of the government's cyber capability was resident and it was interoperable, right? And it was coordinated. We've not done that. And I think before we go creating anything, I think we've got to sort of understand what our capabilities are and are not, what our authorities are in using those capabilities, and how we can use them in a coordinated, more effective way. Look, no question, we need more. Once you figure that out inside the government, then you need to bring in the private sector who can bring additional tools to the game.
So Jane Lute, here's a question that I think gets right to the present moment. How do we reverse the perception after Afghanistan that our friends and allies in the Middle East region may believe we're capable of giving up and abandoning them in a crisis?
I think we learned in Vietnam in 1975 that we can leave. The world saw that we can leave. We have a phrase in the Army. I was in the Army for a really long time, and you have to soldier your way back into trust and good graces. And what is trust? Trust is a value proposition reliably delivered. People know the value proposition of the United States. I would wager that there's not a single major bilateral relationship among two countries around the world that does not consider the backdrop of the relationship to the United States, even with respect to each other. So we are valued. We are, I think, less well understood than people think. People think, oh, the United States is an open book. We get Americans. Actually, I don't think they do. I don't think they get us very well. Having spent an enormous amount of time in the United Nations and abroad in many of these regions around the world. But what we fundamentally offer is the old Abba Eban saying, which, with the US, anything is possible. Without the US, nothing is possible. Americans believe the former. We've never really bought into the latter part. So I think, we just have to soldier our way issue by issue. And force can't do all that needs doing, and all that needs doing can't be done alone. We need to be not only a confident America, a confident partner, but we also need to be a confident teammate when others are in the lead. And there we still have some learning to do.
Jane Harman, Virginia Boney has a question here. Trust in the intelligence community is critical to the public supporting foreign policy decisions based on classified information. In recent years, some government officials have pushed a narrative that the IC has become politicized to advance their agendas. How do we restore public faith in the IC, and are they warranting of it? That's my own addition.
Well, I think, yeah, well, you compared to what? Truth to power. That is the mantra of the intelligence agencies. In the hallowed center hall of the CIA is a statement that I think George H.W. Bush put there when he was CIA director, and the truth shall set you free. Our intelligence community does not make policy, should not make policy. What it should do, and hopefully does do, is present as accurate a projection as possible to the policymakers. Intelligence is not a science. It's a set of predictions based on the best data we can get. And I do know a lot about our capability. We all do. And it is awesome. However, we have seen a few chapters since 9/11 where the IC was politicized and where intelligence was cherry-picked and where national intelligence estimates were inaccurate. And then we saw a recent chapter where top-level officials in the IC were removed and replaced by political operatives. Both of these things have created, a less capable IC, and diminution of trust. So what I would say is, at least focusing on Afghanistan for the moment, my understanding, and I had no classified briefings, I'm not in any role that would justify that, but my understanding from some who did was the IC picture was very accurate, including about the fact that the government could fall quickly, and including that there was rampant corruption, that the troops weren't being paid, they were negotiating deals with the Taliban because they wanted to survive. And that picture was known. The policymakers, for any number of reasons, didn't get it or ignored it. They have a right to ignore what the IC says. I mean, but then you live with it. So I guess I would say that one of the things we fixed fairly well, with a few bumps in the road after 9/11, was our intelligence capability, and we've had pretty competent people in there. And I just hope it is fully restored. I think the Biden picks, especially Bill Burns, I mean, who's an extraordinary asset for our government, and Avril Haines are good. And I think that the White House cares about the intelligence picture. And I don't think there's an effort ongoing now, at least if there is, I'm missing it, to ignore cherry pick. Again, we have to do an after action report on Afghanistan, because no one is going to persuade anyone that it wasn't a messy withdrawal. It was a messy withdrawal. Maybe that was inevitable. But I don't think it was an intelligence community failure.
Well, I think that's all we have time for. I want to thank Aspen for convening all of you today and all of these wonderful and smart audience members on essentially the first of many, many after action reports on the last 20 years since 9/11. Jane, Holl, Lute, I'm going to be thinking a lot about your important injunction to us that right now, the foreign policy threat that we need to be paying the most attention to is the state of American democracy and our ability to work together as a country. But I'm really grateful to Fran, to Jane, all brilliant thinkers, and I can't think of a better group of people to help us, sum up and try to make sense of the moment. And thank you again to Aspen for convening us all today.